The Incas by Nigel Davies. Chapter 2. The first of the Incas. The creation. Before examining the diverse accounts of the foundation or occupation of Cusco by the Incas, one must first ask, what do we know of their more remote origins? What were their creation myths, and how do these compare with those of other Andean peoples? In more precise terms, did such myths come from the coast as Damaris suggests, or rather as Rowe believes, from the Aymara legends of the Lake Titicaca region? Mircea Eliade aptly describes the myth as a form of sacred history in which the actors in the drama are not men but supernatural beings. Myth is thus related to a creation that tells how something first came into existence. It reveals that the world and life itself have a supernatural history, and that this history is significant, precious, and exemplary. Creation myths, to be found in every part of the globe, are essentially narrative and perform the vital function of anchoring a people's present in their past. Most of the principal Inca chroniclers write fairly briefly, if at all, of the original creation of man. If mentioned, it tends to be associated with the Lake Titicaca region, and often with the site of Tiwanaku. For instance, Betanzo states that at a time when all was still and dark, and the creator Tisi Viracocha ruled over a certain people, whose name no one recalls. Viracocha, who first emerged from Lake Titicaca, killed the shadowy beings who had offended him and turned them into stone. Then he rose up from the lake once more and, after creating the sun and the moon, fashioned certain new people out of stone, together with many pregnant women and others who had recently given birth. With these he went to Tiwanaku, and then dispatched them to different places, including Cusco. Cieza de Leon, the first two chapters of his Señorío de los Incas were lost, deals less specifically with the creation of man, focusing on events that occurred when mankind already lived in the Andean region. This omission is scarcely surprising in Peruvian chronicles. It was hard for Spanish Christians, nurtured on the creation story in the book of Genesis, to admit to a second creation in the New World, complete with its own Adam and Eve living in an Andean version of the Garden of Eden. Reluctant to contemplate such heresies, few chroniclers speculated as to how people descended from a single creation in the Old World had reached Peru. Cieza speaks briefly of a flood in Coyao in which only 6 humans survived. Somewhat confusingly, he also writes of a primordial god who equally arose from the island in Lake Titicaca, a being who was tall and white. He did not create mankind, but taught the people he found how they should live, including those who eventually reached Cusco. This creator was commonly called Tichi Viracocha. Though he did not create the world, he first caused the sun to shine upon it. He was able to move mountains and produce huge fountains. Writing some 20 years later, Sarmiento de Gamboa recounts of a similar legend of a world inhabited by giants, who were ultimately destroyed by a flood. As in the Betanzos account, the sun and the moon originally produced no light. In the second age of the world, Viracocha created the present Indian race in the region of Lake Titicaca. Garcilasco de la Vega recounts how he learned of Inca creation legends from sages who visited his mother's house in Cusco. These sages have survived from pre-conquest times. He refers to the creator as our father, the sun, who took pity on mankind's ignorance and sent 2 of his sons to earth. They emerged from Lake Titicaca and proceeded to the Cusco region. But in the Andean cosmogony, there is really no account of the creation of the world ex nihilo, as there is in so many other cultures. Andean chroniclers tend to write of the appearance of tutelary divinities in a world that already existed. George Kluber, writing more of the Andean region as a whole rather than of the Incas in particular, draws attention to stories of multiple creation, or a series of worlds, told by as many as 16 chroniclers before 1650. Some write of only 2 creations, or suns. Others include as many as 4. These sources vividly recalled the Mesoamerican accounts of the birth of 4 or sometimes 5 suns. As an example of such chroniclers, Kluber cites López de Gomara, who wrote in 1552 and tells of 2 primordial gods, Con and Pachacama, for 2 creations of mankind. Con was a man from the north, without bones, who called himself the son of the sun, and settled the earth with men and women. Pachacama was also a son of the sun and moon. He exiled Con, turning humans into black cats. A new race of humans was then destroyed by a flood. Thus, two deities were responsible for two creations. These were followed by two more without named sponsors. The legend of Gon also occurs in ethno-historical data gleaned from many coastal sites described by Rost Rowowski. Gon is a water deity whose cult preceded that of Pachacama. Pedro Gutierrez de Santa Clara, whose work dates from about 1597, tells of only two creations by Gon and Pachacama. They are depicted as a couple who first formed the earth, sun, moon, and sky and engendered all living things before leaving Earth for the sky. Many centuries later, Pachacama came back and destroyed everything, making men into monkeys, as occurred in some versions of the Mexican accounts of the destruction of four sons. Gutierrez's account closely resembles that of Gomara in recording a double creation, first by Gon and thereafter by Pachacama. Kubler lists other chroniclers who tell of multiple creations, including Murua. The latter wrote that the Incas were living under the fifth of a series of suns. Its emblem was the disc of gold in the Cojicancha temple, before which Huayna Capac was crowned. The same scheme is presented in the work of Humana Poma. Calancha, writing in 1630, also tells the story of five sons. Huaman Poma de Ayala wrote between 1612 and 1615, and, unlike most chroniclers, composed his account mainly in Quechua, or Quechua. He enumerates the successive ages. First, the dawn and the cataclysm, and subsequently the 5 ages of man: primeval, legendary, desolation, growth, warfare, and finally Inca. This scheme was widely diffused in a history written for school use in Peru in 1939. The Inca myth of human origins appears to comprise a kind of double creation, at times involving two successive worlds and at others one world peopled by two successive races. In the case of other legends, such as the turning of men into monkeys or the creation of 4 or 5 worlds instead of 2, Kubler finds it hard to avoid the conclusion that they are more of Mesoamerican than of Peruvian origin. Whedon also considers Gutierrez de Santa Clara's work a reflection of that of Gomara, who was so familiar with Mexican sources. Legend of 4 or 5 sons and of the transformation of the inhabitants of past worlds into animals after a series of cataclysms are recorded in detail in classic Nahua and the Legend of the Sons and other pre-Columbian Mexican texts. Kubler suggests that similar myths from Andean sources might derive from a common ancestry in Asiatic Paleolithic times, but such coincidences are surely better explained by the Mexican affiliations of Andean chroniclers who first described them. Another resemblance to Mesoamerica is also present: the tendency to credit the creator, Viracocha, with attributes remarkably similar to those of the Aztec creator god, Quetzalcoatl. Fernando de Alva Ixtlilxochitl depicts the latter deity as a Christ-like figure, fair-skinned, bearded, and dressed in a long white robe, who traveled through the land preaching repentance and the cult of holiness and performing miracles. He eventually reached the Maya land and departed on a raft. Like Quetzalcoatl, Viracocha at times is portrayed as an itinerant deity, white of skin and dressed in a long robe. At the end of his journey, he also departed by sea. Myth becomes saga. If what survives of Inca mythology offers few embellishments than the legends of other peoples, this may be the consequence of the Spaniards' inability or unwillingness to probe deeper. The Andean civilizations as a whole possessed a rich and varied mythology, as portrayed, for instance, on Moche and Nazca ceramics. In this context, however, we are concerned with Inca rather than pan-Andean myths, though according to Demarest's account, Viracocha's cult is virtually inseparable from that of the pre-Inca coastal deity Pachacama. In this, Demarest differs from Rowe, who insists that the events of the basic Inca legend all take place around Lake Titicaca. Rowe thereby deduces that the Incas borrowed their creation saga from the Aymara peoples of that region, implying that this myth was a fairly late compilation based in part on the tale of the Aymara thunder god Tunapa and subsequently revamped by the ruler Pachacutec. Mircea Eliade, in affirming that myths generally tend to tell how something came into existence, attaches great significance to the foundation of cities. But in Inca mythology, in contrast to that of many cultures, most versions suggest that a man had been created before the narration begins. In some accounts, the creator sends his son and daughter to civilize and teach beings who already exist. Similarly, for most chroniclers, Cusco was not quote-unquote founded by the Incas, but was already inhabited when they arrived upon the scene and only later absorbed, together with the surrounding valley, by their early rulers. An exception to this version is Garcilaso, who tells how the son and daughter of the creator founded Cusco after first sinking their magic staff into the earth. Regardless of how far one accepts Rowe's contention that the Viracocha region creation saga was a borrowed version, he may be right in suggesting that much of the Inca legend was contrived by the ruler Pachacutec at a later date. In this instance, it seems that we are faced not with the primordial mythology, but with myth manipulated and modified to serve the ends of the state and empire. This alteration was achieved in part by refurbishing the tale of the first Incas who settled in Cusco, but also in part by stressing the semi-divine genius of the alleged architect of the city's true greatness, Pachacutec. As John Pouvel writes, myth may serve to bring a sacred past to bear preemptively on the present and, inferentially, on the future. At the next level of transmission, the sacred narrative has already been secularized, myth has been turned into saga, sacred time into heroic past, gods into heroes, and mythical action into historical plot. In this context, Franklin Pease writes of the region of Pachacutec as literally a new primordial age identifiable with the origin of the state. In terms of comparative mythology, this phenomenon, which will be further considered in the following chapter, conforms more to George Dumézil's description, not of fictitious creation myths, but of another type of saga. Stories of this type are drawn from authentic events and real actors, though presented in more or less stylized fashion, duly embellished and set forth as an example to emulate. They adorn a remote past or future, performing in inaccessible zones where gods, giants, and demons have their sport. Dumézil, in his many studies of the common Indo-European heritage, points out that every people has its own epic history based on the acts of its heroes and underlying traditional philosophy. Hence, in assessing Inca mythology, perhaps better regarded as Inca narrative saga, the original stress is laid upon the Viracocha legend centered on the Lake Titicaca region. But, as we shall also see later in more detail, the Viracocha cult, originally related in part to that of the thunder god Ilapa, becomes progressively solarized. The main ceremonies are dedicated to Inti, the sun god, and it is Inti who personifies the imperial cult and is imposed as the supreme symbol of Inca rule on the many conquered peoples. The road to Cusco. Inca creation or post-creation mythology may serve as a preface to their early history, which embraces the reigns of the first 7 rulers. The story is told by many chroniclers. On certain matters they generally concur, whereas on others they differ. The great Pachacutec, the 9th ruler, in establishing the households or panancas of the first 7 rulers, in effect formalized a kind of official history that served as a background for the different accounts of early Cusco. Hence, the chroniclers generally agree as to the names of these first 7 Inca rulers who preceded Viracocha, father of the great Pachacutec. As spelled in Rowe's account, they are as follows. Number 1, Manco Capac. Number 2, Sinchi Roca. Number 3, Lolki Yupanqui. Number 4, Maita Capac. Number 5, Capac Yupanqui. Number 6, Inca Roca. Number 7, Yahuar Huaca. A variant on this theme is the version of Montesinos, who, not content with an enlarged succession of Inca rulers, names a bewildering array of supposedly pre-Inca kings. This list, now generally discounted, achieved a short-lived credibility in the work of Clements Markham, The Incas of Peru. Philip Ainsworth Means, whose Ancient Civilizations of the Andes was published in 1931, accepted the orthodox list of 7 rulers given above, but, largely following Garcilaso's account, stretched the Inca chronology and credited these earlier rulers with spectacular triumphs. Starting with the conquest of Lake Titicaca Basin in about AD 1200. According to this Garcilasan version, the 3rd Inca, Loki Yupanqui, advanced into Colao and conquered the province of Chucuito. The 4th, Maita Capac, occupied the ancient site of Tiwanaku and thereafter proceeded to subdue the Arequipa region. His successor, Capac Yupanqui, had scarcely ascended the throne before he embarked on a long-range campaign of conquest. Rowe helps to clarify the issue by listing both the chroniclers who credited the early rulers with such conquests and those who denied that such conquests occurred. But the shorter list of those who followed the Garcilasco line and favor early conquests includes chroniclers such as Murua and Huaman Poma, whose data are of a lesser historical significance. Many accounts exist of the arrival of the first Incas into the Cusco Valley. Cieza de Leon states that he based his account of their coming on what he learned from Gayo Tupac, son of Sadi Tupac, heir of the post-conquest Inca rebel Manco, and hence a descendant of Huayna Capac. Cieza and other chroniclers offer a fairly uniform version of these early happenings, which can be summarized as follows. Proceeding from the Lake Titicaca region, the Incas reached Paucatambo, lying to the southeast of Cusco. Their leader, Manco, was accompanied by 3 brothers, in some versions by 2, each of whom had a sister wife. From Paucatambo, they proceeded to the hill of Huanacauri, some 8 miles from Cusco. Here, one brother, Ayar Chachi, was turned to stone. Ayar Chachi was an almost godlike figure of prodigious strength. He could throw boulders that would level whole hills. Sometimes those cast by his sling flew so high that they rose above the clouds. He entered a cave, and his brothers blocked the entrance. He was then turned into a huaca, or sacred stone, which became one of the most holy objects in Inca ritual. The second brother, Ayar Uchu, was transformed into a winged being and therefore was changed into a stone at Matawa on the slopes of Huanacauri. The third brother, Ayar Auca, reportedly flew on ahead of Manco to Cusco. When he alighted there, he became the community stone called Cusco Huanca, the field of Cusco. Having rid himself of his brothers, Manco, accompanied by his wife, Mama Oclo, reached Cusco. There, according to Cieza and others, he built the first Coricancha temple. Manco, according to Sarmiento, found Cusco already inhabited and fought battles against nearby peoples, variously named Hualas and Alcavisas. Though certain sources, in particular Cieza, Cobo, Sarmiento, and Cabello de Balboa, offer some details of each of the early reigns, others, such as Betanzos, say little about them. Certain specific events are common to these sources, though at times the chroniclers disagree as to the reign in which they occurred. For instance, Cieza states that the fourth ruler, Maita Capac, marries a princess from Oma, about 5 miles from Cusco, whereas Cobo says that it was his predecessor, Loki Yupanqui, who married the daughter of the ruler of Oma. The war against the Ayamarcas, is attributed by Cieza to Inca Roca, but by Sarmiento to Inca Roca's successor, Yahuahuaca. In certain instances, these sources differ sharply. For instance, for Sarmiento, the second Inca, Chinchi Roca, was not a man of war, whereas for Murua, he was a great military leader. Equally, Sarmiento describes Loki Yupanqui as an indolent monarch, whereas Cobo states that he subdued many local lords and fought battles against the Ayamarcas. Often they differ considering marriages. Cieza maintains that Chinchi Rocha married his sister, but Cobo states that he wedded the daughter of a neighboring chief. In reality, the practice of marrying a sister was probably a late introduction into Inca custom. Cieza also writes that the sixth ruler, Inca Roca, married his sister, though this is denied by other sources. Nonetheless, a curious kind of common thread does seem to run through these rather conflicting accounts of early Cusco, as if they were based, at least in part, on some single standard or official version. For instance, Cieza, Cobo, Sarmiento, and Cabello agree in mentioning the Incas' arrival at Paucatambo and their proceeding thence to Huanacauri. All give the same information as to the distances of these two places from Cusco itself, 7 and 4 leagues, respectively. All agree that Maita Capac succeeded the throne when he was still very young and, equally, that this prince fought against the Alcavisas. To Capac Yupanqui, some southward excursion into Condasuyu is generally ascribed. To the sixth ruler, Inca Roca, is almost invariably attributed to the division of the capital into Harin, Lower, and Hanan, Upper Cusco. He is stated to have been the first ruler to govern from Hanan, Cusco, whereas his predecessors had lived in Hurin in Coricancha. Hence, accounts do seem to have some common, if cryptic, background, to which each chronicler adds his own embellishments. The fullest accounts of the first six reigns are those of Sarmiento and Cabello de Balboa. Though they wrote their chronicles in 1572 and 1586, respectively, they seem to have obtained virtually the same data from a single version of events. Much of this information is not included, for instance, in C.S.'s earlier work. The two writers tell a very similar story, mixing the obviously fabulous with the ostensibly factual, though differing on lesser details. Their stories of the deeds of the last two rulers before the conquest, Tupac Inca and Huayna Capac, have so many items in common, including textually identical passages, that they seem to derive to a considerable degree from some common source, as we shall later see in detail. To cite a specific instance of their record of the early rulers, in describing Mayta Capac, the fourth king, both start by telling of confrontations between the Incas on the one hand, and Alcavisas and Colunchimas on the other. The latter are described as natives of Cusco, implying that the Inca presence in that place was as not yet very firmly established. Both then tell a confused story of how the Inca's adversary sent 10 Indians with the intention of killing Mayta Capac and his father Loki Yupanqui, who was still reigning, in their abode in the Temple of the Sun. Sarmiento states that the prince Mayta Capac killed one of the 10 by hurling a ball with which he was playing. The others fled. Cabello merely differs in stating that 2 of the invaders were killed. In both versions, the Alcavisas attack Cusco and reach the walls of Coricancha. Loki Yupanqui is panic-stricken, but is told by his advisors, Alus in Sarmiento and priests in Cabello, to place full reliance on his son, Mayta Capac. A magic hailstorm, rather than Mayta's prowess, puts the Alcavisas to flight. After this event, Mayta Capac ascends the throne and reportedly rules peacefully, fighting no more wars. Both chroniclers give details of his marriage to Mama Takukarai in the name of the same 3 sons. Cobo, incidentally, also names the same wife and 2 of the sons of the marriage. To mention one further example, other sources concur that the 6th ruler, Inca Roca, was the first to divide Cusco into Anan, Upper, and Urin, Lower Cusco. To this brief tale, Sarmiento and Cabello add further parallel details. For instance, Roca conquers Muina, said to be the 4 leagues distant from Cusco by Sarmiento, and then captures or kills the leaders of the pueblos of Muina and Huamantupa. Any such conversions of these 2 leading chroniclers' accounts comes to be a factor of major significance in judging the provenance of their data regarding the conquests of later reigns. Gary Urton points out that the Incas had come to be identified with or concretized to the town of Paucatambo, but points to the disconcerting fact that no certainty exists as to the location of a site of that name between the mid-1530s and early 1570s. The Paucatambo that exists today, about 18 miles southeast of Cusco, came into existence, according to documentary evidence, in 1571, 1 year prior to the completion of Sarmiento's history. Urton questions whether Sarmiento might not have prodded his informants to get them to identify the original place in concrete geographical terms. Urton further comments on the phenomenon of the existence of 2 series of origin myths, one centered upon Lake Titicaca and the other recording the Inca emergence from the cave of Paucartambo. Given the overall significance of the historical traditions of the Aymara kingdoms around Lake Titicaca, it is not surprising that the Incas might have sought such associations as a legitimate mandate for the rule. However, it is surely harder to justify a myth centered upon Paucartambo then as now something of a political and cultural backwater. Alternative approaches. Rowe was among the first scholars to pose the question of whether the rulers before Viracocha made real conquests. He concludes that the triumphs attributed to these kings were mere raids, and that the same places had to be reconquered again in subsequent reigns. This conclusion would appear logical in the absence of evidence to the contrary. One is, however, left with the impression that even if their hold on the surrounding region was tenuous, the rulers that preceded Viracocha Inca may have at least begun to achieve a certain primacy over their late neighbors, though perhaps not to the extent of exacting regular tribute. Rowe has suggested that the period of the first 8 Inca rulers, including Viracocha, lasted from about AD 1200 until 1438, the date he gives following the Cabello de Babor chronology for the accession of Pachacutec. He further mentions pre-Inca remains in 4 sites in the valley of Cusco belonging to what he calls the Chanapata culture. Their pottery is well made and abundant, metal objects are lacking, and very few remains of buildings can be identified. For the early Inca period, the pottery is classified within the Quilqui series, named from a site near Cusco where Rowe first identified this ware. In the 3 sites named, one of which lies literally within the great fortress of Sacsayhuaman, metal continues to be rare and bone tools are common. Wall foundations are of uncut fieldstones. Quilca is described as a carelessly executed ware whose designs are linear and geometric. It displays some relationship to the contemporary Colao black on red common in the region of Puno and to some of the characteristic motifs used by late Inca potters. Gonzalo Corrales, giving more data on Quilca pottery, also mentions a Quilqui wall. Based on much more recent investigations of Quilqui pottery, Brian Bauer in effect suggests that the Incas were not invaders of the Cusco Valley, but had lived there already for many centuries. He proposes that the incipient Inca state was not localized within the city of Cusco, but incorporated a much broader region. He cites Huaman Poma as stating that Incas, i.e. those with ear perforations, came from a fairly extensive area around the city, having already become Incas by privilege, Incas de Privilegio, at a comparatively early date. Bauer thus associates the birth of the Inca state with much of the Quilca period, which on the basis of radiocarbon dating he believes to have started as early as AD 1000, after the abandonment of the Huari site of Picalacta, rather than about AD 1200 as previously proposed by Rowe. Bauer, in effect, expands the views of Mosley, who argues that the origins of Cusco may have derived from Quilca times. Though Cusco's expansion during that era is not well understood, such expansion might have begun much earlier than Inca lore would suggest. Admittedly, evidence for the association of the Incas with Quilca pottery seems to be somewhat tenuous at present, but the notion that they were basically native to the valley of Cusco nonetheless merits serious consideration. To cite a parallel instance, I myself, though not altogether accepting Bauer's tendency to disparage event-based history, have consistently proposed, in agreement with Rudolf van Zandtvik and others, that the Mexica, later to become known as Aztecs, were not predominantly nomads, but people who had resided for several centuries in the Valley of Mexico and who later merged with a smaller nomad group from the north. Hence, the story of their wanderings from Aztlan might therefore be at least partly mythical. Rowe includes this period of the 7 rulers in what he calls the more or less historic time. Brundage goes somewhat further and devotes a full chapter of his Empire of the Inca to the first 7 rulers, narrating events of each reign. In view of contradictions between certain chroniclers on these early rulers, however, this kind of history must rely on individual judgment as to which of several accounts can be more logically woven into a coherent story. Alfred Metro, writing in 1961 in his History of the Incas, already sounded a warning note about the reliability of such accounts of the deeds of the earlier Incas. At first sight, the precision with which their reigns are numbered, and the stories they tell us, inspire confidence. On closer examination, this favorable impression is found to be illusory. Behind a superabundance of often insignificant detail, the big historical events grow blurred, and in spite of their apparent exactitude, are found to amount to very little. It is naturally in the more distant periods that the line dividing myth from history is most difficult to trace. If on the whole the chroniclers agree in their account of events, these are not always attributed to the same Inca. It is not uncommon for some events to have a double use and to be told in the same manner about 2 separate reigns. The dynastic lists do not always agree, and father, son, and grandson are sometimes mistaken for one another. Metro aptly describes the uncertainties that beset the accounts of early Cusco. Zuidema goes much further in seeking to demonstrate that myths relating to Inca Roca and even to Pachacutec were also attached in certain accounts to the later kings. Tupac Yupanqui and Huayna Capac, still remembered by certain informants of the Spanish chroniclers. Because mythical elements are present in accounts of events up to the time of the Spanish conquest, Zuidema asks, how do we distinguish historicized myth that sounds reasonable in terms of history from real history, even where it concerns the last kings? We do not have to doubt that the persons existed, but there is every reason to be critical in accepting events in the generational sequence as given. According to Zuidema, chroniclers writing after Molina and Polo Ondegardo further modified this scheme to make it more and more reasonable to Western understanding. Zuidema adds that the same confusion applies to our knowledge of Inca social organization. The relationship between the Panacas and Ayllus is obscure and only achieves a more logical sense when related to a cosmological structure, although an understanding of this relationship is basic to Inca political institutions and history. In another context, Zuidema further stresses the mythological content of Inca history. Inca history, then, integrates religious, calendrical ritual, and remembered facts into one ideological system, which was hierarchical in terms of space and time. This Inca hierarchical ideology should not be confused with the Western linear concept of history imposed by the Spanish. Zuidema suggests that a historical chronology up to the task might seem hard to achieve in the immediate future, although archaeological research has indeed made impressive additions to our knowledge of the range of Inca conquest and, to a more limited extent, of the sequence in which those conquests might have taken place. Descriptions of Inca history as largely mythological might be treated by some investigators as overstated or exaggerated if taken out of context. However, the basic message conveyed by such conclusions, they believe that in the Inca chroniclers an element of myth is seldomly wholly absent, is surely not without a certain validity. It may be tempting, though not necessarily accurate, to dismiss the story of the first 7 rulers as pure fiction, but such labels can hardly be applied to Pachacutec or even to his father Viracocha Inca. As noted above, a kind of common thread seems to connect the principal chroniclers' accounts of early rulers, a thread that might be seen as based on something more solid than mere invention. Moreover, in the final instance, the historian cannot escape the fact that, if these monarchs were expunged from the record as totally fictitious, then wholly anonymous leaders would simply have to be credited with the same achievements, namely, the feats of acquiring over a few generations of at least a certain control over part of the valley of Cusco. Without some such preponderance, Pachacutec's spectacular defeat of the Chancas, as described by the chroniclers, would have surely been unattainable. The Albin king list, which by a most curious coincidence also consists of 7 shadowy monarchs who ruled before the foundation of Rome, might be viewed in a comparable light. Few today believe the list to amount to much more than a fiction, but any suggestion that there are insufficient grounds to give it any credence are apt to be greeted with outraged cries of hypercriticism. The whole justification for these kings lies in their function of bridging the gap between the fall of Troy and the foundation of Rome, regardless of whether the actual names are correct. Given the vagueness of the written evidence concerning the first 7 Inca kings, it would surely be hard to dispel the cloud of uncertainty by any attempt to describe this era reign by reign. Possibly this initial period, whose length we really ignore, might be best divided simply into early and late. The early phase, beginning with the quote-unquote founder, Manco Capac, is rich in elements of pure myth involving the elimination of his brothers, turned into stone huacas or even into birds. Of his successor, Sinchiroca, almost nothing of note is reported, and the third ruler, Loki Yupanqui, is generally described as pacific or inactive. In the earliest of these pre-Pachacutec reigns, the Incas may have strengthened their hold on most of what became the city of Cusco, leading to inevitable conflict with other peoples who occupied the region, in particular the Alcavisas, mentioned by many sources. In the later portion of this era of the 7 kings, embracing perhaps the 4th, 5th, 6th, and even 7th reigns, the Incas may have tightened their grip on the side of Cusco and even ventured farther afield on forays that scarcely deserve to rank as conquests. In contrast to the reportedly passive 3rd ruler, the 4th, Maita Capac, is said to have led victories over Alcavisas and clashes with Ayamarcas. The sixth, Roca, is generally credited, as we have seen, with the division of the city into Upper Hanan and Lower Korean Cusco, and with the relocation of the leading dynasty in Hanan Cusco. The latter is in itself an event of great importance, implying the complete domination of at least of the elongated triangle between the two rivers, later to become the core of urban Cusco. Cabela reports that Inca Roca advanced farther from Cusco than his predecessor, but the mention by certain sources of expeditions to Condasuyu, lying to the southwest, or to places on the road to Colao to the southeast, should not be taken to imply long-range conquests. Only the Garcilascan school pretends that at this stage the Incas advanced deep into Colao. Two kings or one. Even such a brief and tentative review of the early Inca monarchy poses certain questions worthy of comment as relevant to the future course of events. First, a basic feature of the historic Cusco was its division into two moedes, Hurin and Hanan. This step is attributed by some to Manco Capac, but more generally associated with the sixth ruler, Inca Roca. Rorowski suggests that the division of the Andean cities into upper and lower halves stems from a remote past. In this respect, it may be worth noting that Michael Mosley raises the possibility that moede organization and dual role prevailed in the pre-Inca kingdom of Timor. He presents the last four ciudadelas, or palaces, of Chanchan as being built in pairs, with the principal ruler residing in the eastern palace and his segunda persona occupying a more modest structure in the western moiety. Rorowski, however, questions whether, in fact, duality was not first imposed by the Incas when they conquered the region. Rorowski further demonstrates that the practice was almost universal, existing in polities as distant from one another as Puno on Lake Titicaca, the Cañari region of Ecuador, the coastal Yungas, and certain settlements of the high Andes. Sarmiento even relates that the Chancas, the Incas' implacable foes, were divided into Hurin and Hanan Chanca, each with its own ruler, the latter being more powerful of the two. Among the more notable examples of dual rule are of the Lupaca, of which we have an eyewitness account in the 1567 visita of Garcidias de San Miguel. At the time of this visita, the Lupaca were still divided into Hanansaya and Hurinsaya, governed respectively by Don Martin Gari and Don Martin Cusi. Gari and Cusi had been the traditional names of the rulers of the two moieties. Murra questions whether this dual monarchy could not have been imposed on the Lupaca by the Incas, a suggestion that might imply some kind of dual government in Cusco itself involving not only a division into two halves, but also the presence of two kings. The Relaciones Geográficas in some instances do mention the Incas' involvement in imposing a dual division on others. The Soras, who lived in the vicinity of the Huamanga, were divided into two groups, Hananzora and Urinzora. The Relaciones attribute this dual division to a system implanted by the Incas when they first conquered the land. The division of Cusco, in conformity with so many other places, into two halves lies at the very root of the system of control of the city and of its future empire. With respect to certain parts of the Incas' domain, the question remains somewhat open as to how far the Urin-Anan duality existed already or was introduced by the conquerors. Another question raised by certain authors is whether the two Cuscos, upper and lower, might have been ruled not by one but two dynasties, as occurred, for instance, in Colao. Rorowski elaborates on this theme, but agrees that any suggestion of dual government is purely a hypothesis, almost impossible to prove in practice. She writes of the possibility that the first Incas to approach Cusco might have had two rulers inside Sarmiento, Cabello, and Betanzos, as stating that a second of the original four brothers, Ayar Auca, settled in Cusco in addition to Aymar Manco, the founder mentioned by all sources. Manco's older two brothers had already been converted into Huacas. The sources unite in stating that Corincancha was the residence of the Urin rulers, whereas those of Anan built their own palaces. If Manco belonged to the Hurin moiety, conceivably Ayar Auca was the progenitor of the Hanan Incas, who installed themselves in the upper part of the settlement. The name Auca indicates that its possessor was principally a warrior. in conformity with the prevailing notion of Hanan as the more warlike and hence more powerful moiety. The consensus is that the Hanan dynasty launched the great territorial expansion, whereas Hurin reportedly prevailed in matters of religion. Zuidema, in writing of the same problem, quotes Polo de Ondegardo as treating the Hurin and Hanan dynasties, both descended from Manco, the first ruler, as contemporary halves of a dual kingship. In Zuidema's reconstruction of Polo's data, Manco heads to the king list as sole ruler. The second place on the list features two kings, Sinchi Roca as ruler of Hanan and Inca Roca as ruler of Hurin. The fourth place is jointly occupied by Maita Capac as ruler of Hurin and Pachacutec as contemporary Hanan ruler. Like Rost-Rorowski, Zuidema agrees that any supposition concerning a dual dynasty remains unproven. Some will trust certain facts or dates of the Inca as historical, whereas others consider as more important how Inca concepts of their past might help to clarify Inca culture in general. Even if a dual Inca dynasty might be preferred, comparing it to other Andean institutions outside Cusco, we do not know whether or how such a dynasty really did exist in Cusco. Zuidema further suggests, as already proposed in his earlier work, the Seca system of Cusco, that the Hurin-Hanan split reveals itself as a division into right and left sides, facing upriver of the Huatanay River. Fortresses and military installations are all to be found on the right side of the Huatanay. Pierre Duvois is the leading exponent of the theory of a dual monarchy, as expressed in his 1979 paper, The Dynasty of the Incas, Monarchy or Duarchy. His initial scheme also derives from Polo and, in agreement with Zuidema's analysis, identifies Maita Capac as the fourth Hurin subruler, paired with Pachacutec. Only Pachacutec's successors became sole leaders, without any Hurin co-ruler, again in agreement with Zuidema. Duvois produces Zuidema's parallel list of rulers, but attributes the roster more to Acosta, though it needs to be borne in mind that, according to Acosta himself, much of the material on Peru in his Historia Natural de Moral de los Indias was derived or perhaps copied from Polo. Duvois cites certain documents as avoiding any reference to the existence of Hurin rulers prior to those of Hanan, but his sources include chroniclers such as Lopez de Gomara, whose information, as we have seen, tended to reflect his Mexican experiences, and Montesinos, described by Wadin as practically useless in providing information on the Incas. More relevant is perhaps Duvois's reference to a state by Cieza de Leon, who indeed mentions Indian reports to the effect that one Inca leader had to be from one moiety and the other from the other moiety, though not necessarily reigning at the same time. Cieza, however, goes on to say that he gives little credit to this report, which differs from what the nobles had told him. Duvois also cites another chronicler, Cristobal De Molina, known as El Cusqueno, whose Fabulas y Ritos de los Incas, dated 1575, was the product of careful inquiry among the survivors of the clergy of the native religion. De Molina recalls that the Inca, on his accession, would name an important relative to take charge of certain affairs, and that this quote-unquote second person was connected with the priest of the sun. But this assertion implies the presence of not of a co-ruler in the fullest sense, but rather a kind of coadjutors chosen specifically from within Cusco, where the temple of the sun was situated. Duvials, moreover, cites Santillan as writing of a secretary who was informed of all the affairs of the state. Even the later Inca rulers seemed to have a kind of alter ego. Huayna Capac had an advisor, Auquitopa, who was always with him. Sarmiento also notes that De la Bandera describes Auquitopa as Huayna Capac's secretary. Cabello even states that Pachacutec named Apo Maita, his brother, second person in military operations. Huaman Poma de Ayala, however, portrays his own grandfather, Guaman Chinchay Suyu, as Huayna Capac's second person. Described also as a captain general, he conquered the province of Quito. Duvials rightly points to the inability of the Spaniards to conceive of any type of monarchy except their own, noting also the Incas' lack of interest in explaining their system to their conquerors. But for Duvials, as for others, the notion of a dual monarchy is basically a hypothesis, even though he describes the legend of the change of dynasty from Hurin to Hanan as absurd. The existence of a kind of special assistant from sacerdotal class of Hurin is not incompatible with the single monarchy based on Hanan. It might be a vestige from earlier times of some kind of dual rule, a system that continued in Colao, whose influence on Inca culture is undeniable. Moreover, Duvial's reference to the possible selection by each Inca ruler of his own Hurin-based coadjutor, whose office would terminate on that ruler's death, would eliminate the objection that a neat dual king list is hard to conceive because the reign of a given Hanan king could hardly coincide with that of a Hurin colleague, i.e., a single long-lived ruler of one dynasty might have outlived successive kings of the other. The story of the first 7 rulers is so fragmentary that the possibility that they might have, in certain cases, reigned simultaneously is not to be excluded. A further possibility arises, though it is seldom proposed. Until the time of the 6th ruler, Inca Roca, the Incas, who according to all accounts faced many hostile neighbors, might have controlled only part of Cusco, the sector of the city centered upon Coricancha and lying nearest to the confluence of the 2 rivers. The Alcavisas still lived in Cusco at the time of the 4th Inca. It would then have been natural for Roca to install his government in the upper part, newly secured, and henceforth Hanan would have taken precedence in temporal affairs over Hurin, which preserved its significance more as a religious center. If from the time of their arrival the Incas had also occupied Hanan, then Hanan, in accordance with traditional Andean norms, surely would have been predominant over Hurin, and over the dynasty generally described as installed in Coricancha. Dualism is an ever-present factor in human society in one form or another. In Persia, Zoroastrianism was a religion impregnated with the principle of dualism, and in China the yin-yang precept served as the ethical basis of society. The division of cities in 2 or 4 distant sectors, each with a distant role, is also a common practice throughout the world. For instance, in India, ancient cities were divided into 4 parts. The most high-ranking class of citizens, the Brahmans, lived in the northern or upper sector, which thus became predominant. Examples of dual political control are not hard to find, whether in the form of 2 kings in Sparta or of 2 consuls in Rome. However, in early imperial times, Rome came to be governed by 1 ruler. Moreover, it is hard to imagine that a system of divided control would have been well suited to the phase of expansion set in by Pachacutec and to the conquest of the immense Inca realm. Fundamental to this process of conquest was the imperial solar cult, imposed on the provinces as the essential symbol of Inca control. This cult was clearly based on the godlike status of a single monarch, not of 2. The immortal kings. One of the strangest facets of Inca kingship requires mention at this point, as it came to involve the more shadowy early rulers as well as their better documented successors. In Cusco, the descendants of each Inca, excluding the reigning monarch, constituted a group known as a panaca. This group's mission was to conserve the dead ruler's mummy and to immortalize his life and achievements with the help of chants and rituals performed on ceremonial occasions in the presence of the reigning king and the mummies of other dead Incas. These rites were passed on from generation to generation. Each panaca possessed lands, worked by numerous slaves or servants known as llana. The royal panacas formed the elite of Cusco, and doubtless their differences contributed to a chronic instability marked by periodic plots against reigning monarchs and in particular by confrontations over the succession when a ruler died. Rorowski suggests that the panacas might be an early phenomenon in Inca history and that the adherents of Ayar Manco and Ayar Auca might have used this term to denote their followers. But even if the system had such ancient roots, it was revitalized by Pachacutec. Sarmiento, for instance, tells how Pachacutec disinterred the bodies of the first 7 Incas, situated in the Temple of the Sun. Betanzos even states that Pachacutec was responsible for the fashioning of mortuary bundles of the remains of these 7 rulers, which were then set on thrones beside that of his own father. He adds that it was Pachacutec who provided the lands and servants for the lavish maintenance of the panacas, which henceforth played such a leading role in Cusco. After the death of Huayna Capac, shortly before the Spanish invasion, there were 11 such mummies. On ceremonial occasions, that of Huayna Capac was flanked on one side by those of the Hurin rulers, and on the other by the 5, including his father, Tupac, of the Hanan dynasty. Matters were somewhat complicated by the existence of 5 additional panacas, 2 belonging to Hanan and 3 to Hurin. Also present in Cusco was the institution of the Ayu, or Ailu rather, a kingship group that still exists in present-day Peru. The possibility arises that originally the terms Panaca and Ailu might have been synonymous. However, they developed on somewhat different lines. A probable difference between them was that the Ailu was patrilineal and the Panaca matrilineal. The Cusco Ayllu system embraced not only the royal Ayllus, of which there were at the time of the conquest 11, 6 in Hanan and 5 in Hurin, but also those of the Incas by privilege, or privilegio, formed not by the nobles of Inca descent, but by leaders of neighboring peoples who have been granted this title. The original Incas, often kin of the ruler, were called orejones, thus named because their ears were pierced with unusually large holes. Rowe gives perhaps the best description of the Ayllu. The earliest modern writers insisted that it was a clan, but chroniclers' accounts fail to clarify the precise role of the ancient Ayllu because of the looseness of Quechua terminology. Rowe rejects the description of the Ayllu as a clan, as it was not a totemic group derived from some animal ancestor. He defines the Ayllu as a kin group with theoretical endogamy, with descent in the male line, and without totemism. Its most important function was the ownership of a well-defined territory, within which each married couple cultivated a parcel of land sufficient for their support. Zuidema also views the Ayllu as being related to a shared territory. The land could not be sold, but members of one Ayllu could also hold land in another in which they did not live. However, both men and women belonged, and may still belong today, to the Ayllu in which they resided, and in which they possessed the right and eventual obligation to occupy an office in the political and religious hierarchies. Problems involving the status of the Ayllus and Panacas are inseparable from the Seque system in Cusco. Both in Cusco and in the surrounding country, numerous sanctuaries and huacas, many connected with the royal Panacas, were situated on seques or imaginary lines. Seques were divided into 4 sections or quarters, as defined by the principal roads radiating from the capital in the direction of the 4 quarters of Cusco and of Tawantinsuyu, the Inca Empire. These quarters were called Chinchasuyu, Antisuyu, Kolyasuyu, and Kondisuyu, occasionally written Kuntinsuyu. This complicated Seque system was an ancient institution, found both among Quechua and Aymara-speaking peoples. Zuidema made an extensive study. The Seque system of Cusco, published in 1964. He stresses both the antiquity of the system in Andean civilization and its extreme complexity. In all, there were 41 seques radiating from the Temple of the Sun, and on these were situated 328 huacas in and around the city, together with a number of sanctuaries. These seques played an important part in the calendrical system and in Inca religion in general, including such aspects as child sacrifice. The most puzzling aspect of the system is the association of the seques with the royal Panacas. A seemingly arbitrary number of royal sanctuaries is connected with each. In general terms, earlier rulers such as Sinchiroca and Loki Yupanqui had only one sanctuary or one huaca situated on a seque. By contrast, Pachacutex's Panaca was more generously endowed, but his successor, Tupac, also had only one huaca situated on a seque. Although sanctuaries can be identified with certain Panacas, the data leave us confused as to the association of political divisions with groups of seques. Zuidema, in his most valuable, if involved description, lays much emphasis on the importance of seques not only for religious ritual in general, but also for the related task of astronomical observation. In a more recent work, Zuidema writes of certain specific seques, in particular the first seque of Antisuyu, which was important in relation to Pachacutec, Ayarmacas, and others. The Incas found various peoples already established in the Cusco region, groups frequently mentioned by the sources. Their identity is more important than might appear at first sight. By all accounts, the Inca themselves were limited in number, and it was these neighbors, once subdued, who came to form a large proportion of the inhabitants of the core region of the empire. Their elite, granted the title of Inca by privilege, played an important role in the Inca state. The sources' accounts of these pre-Inca inhabitants scarcely permit a coherent analysis of their respective roles or even of the order in which their confrontations with the Incas occurred. Groups reportedly encountered by the first three Inca rulers include the Hualas and the Saucirais. In particular, the first ruler, Manco Capac, is credited with victories over these two peoples. Cabello de Babor describes the Huala ruler, Copali Maita, as the Señor Natural de Cusco. However, Sarmiento goes so far as to affirm that Manco killed the entire Huala population, taking special care to eliminate pregnant women and their embryo offspring in order to ensure that no trace of them should survive. This chronicler states that Manco also defeated the Saucirais, then located in a crucial triangle between the two rivers. Brundage cites evidence to the effect that the Saucirais, who had arrived in the Cusco Valley later than the Hualas, controlled the important crossing over the Tulumayo River, whereas another newly arrived group, the Alcavisas, who had also crossed over into the triangle, dominated the equally important passage over the Huatanay River. In particular, the Informaciones of the Viceroy Toledo, always anxious to depict the Incas as usurpers, treat the Saucirais and Hualas as the earliest inhabitants and state that the Ayllu of the Saucirais, which still existed when he wrote, had occupied part of Cusco where Coricancha was later built. Somewhat more formidable were the Alcavisas, mentioned by Ciesa, Sarmiento, and Cabello as having been routed by the fourth Inca, Maita Capac. Toledo, presumably drawing his conclusions from a common tradition confirmed by the many informants that he gathered, concurs that it was Maita Capac who subdued the Alcavisas and drove them from the central part of Cusco. He mentions that they still lived very near to Cusco at this time. Outstanding among the early adversaries of the Incas were the Ayamarcas. In a detailed study, Rosbrovowski notes the significance of the fact that the four Inca brothers who traditionally set forth from their legendary home were themselves named Ayar Cache, Ayar Uchu, Ayar Auca, and Ayar Manco. She cites Murua and Garcilasco as affirming that the Ayamarcas occupy a fairly extensive territory that stretched toward the Vilcanora River, about 10 miles north of Cusco, but also embrace 18 villages south of Cusco. Her account includes a map of areas still occupied by Ayamarcas in the 18th century, naming in particular various Aylus in the Pucyura area, about 12 miles northwest of Cusco. The same author points out that Tokay Capac and Pinawa Capac are generic names of the two Ayarmaca chiefs, as reported in many 16th century manuscripts. Possibly these corresponded to Hordin and Hanan Moeris, suggestive of a dual rulership of the kind mentioned above. Most reports of the Inca hostilities against the Ayarmacas belong to the reign of the sixth ruler, Inca Roca. These are linked to the legend related by certain sources, though omitted by others, of the kidnapping by the Ayamacas of Roca's son, who became the seventh ruler, Yahuahuaca. The latter, when still a child, was reportedly consigned to the people of Huaylacan, who concealed his whereabouts by making him serve as a simple herdsman in the mountains for a whole year. After a hard-fought battle, the prince was liberated, and the rift between Incas and Ayarmacas was at least temporarily healed by a double marriage between their ruling houses. According to Sarmiento, further hostilities ensued in the reign of Viracocha, and the Ayarmacas were finally subjugated by Pachacutec, following his epic struggle against the Chancas. After the Chanca defeat, the Ayarmacas were the first to face the victorious ruler. The Tokay Capac of the time reportedly refused to submit, considering himself a leading potentate in his own right. He assembled a large force but was defeated. Many of his subjects were massacred, and he was taken to Cusco, where he died as a captive. The Ayarmacas did not play a leading role in the expanding Inca Empire, but did retain a place in the Cusco Seque system. The eighth of the 9th Seques, corresponding to Antisuyu, was named Ayarmaca. Uncertain premises. As we have seen, it is hard to offer a very coherent picture of Inca society, let alone a chronology of events, prior to the initial phase of imperial conquest. Not only chroniclers, but also modern authors disagree. For some of the latter, the early rulers are historical personalities, almost comparable to some early medieval kings. For others, they are pure legend. Many scholars accept Rose's summing up as a fair appraisal of the problem. According to Rowe, reports that depict Cusco as little more than a village until the mid-15th century are probably correct. He observes that the more credible sources write only of a very limited conquest before the reign of Pachacutec, conquest so inconclusive that this ruler had to reconquer the same places. In another context, Rowe aptly sums up the situation. In early times, neither the Inca nor any other neighbors thought of organizing their conquests as a permanent domain. A defeated village was looted, and perhaps a tribute was imposed on it, but otherwise it was left alone until it recovered sufficient strength to be a menace again. Down to the reign of Pachacutec, towns very near to Cusco preserved complete freedom of action and raided one's territory whenever there seemed to be a good opportunity for plunder. Yahuahuaca and Viracocha were probably responsible for the first attempts to organize conquered territory, at least around the capital itself, and their successful campaigns gave the Inca state a political importance it had entirely lacked in earlier times. This last sentence of this passage is significant. Surely, at least, the credit for certain achievements must be conceded to Pachacutec's immediate predecessors, as his spectacular career is hardly conceivable if at the outset he could claim nothing but disputed control over a single village. Rowski asks whether Cusco was not first dominated by some fairly powerful non-Inca ruler. It is difficult to see how it ever rose to prominence if the rulers or ruler lacked power and means. It is far from clear to what extent the Incas themselves were native to the Cusco region. Sources write of the first rulers of Cusco as emerging from Paucartambo, a mere 18 miles distant. But in Inca religion and mythology, some kind of connection with the Lake Titicaca region is undeniable. In view of the presence of the Inca pantheon of Viracocha, the creator divinity whose cult by all accounts originated in Collao. As Pease writes, modern archaeologists agree with the early chroniclers in maintaining that at the time immediately prior to the transformation of Tawantinsuyu, a significant relationship existed between the reign of Cusco and that of Lake Titicaca. The existence of some Collao connection is thus hardly in dispute, even if the extent to which Viracocha should be regarded as an early introduction into the Inca pantheon is, as we have seen, more open to question. Hence, no consensus exists as to how far this pantheon may serve as proof of early links with the Collao region. Many peoples cherish their myths of early migration from an earlier sacred place of origin, though archaeologists nowadays tend to question migration legends as overall explanations of the historical record. For myself, as for certain other authors, the Mexicas, the builders of the Aztec Empire, consisted of a blend between the legendary group of migrants from afar and other groups local to the Valley of Mexico. Similarly, it is not inconceivable that the Incas represent a unique blend arising from a merging of migrants from the Lake Titicaca area with peoples native to the Cusco region. Such a mingling might serve to account both for the oft-repeated series of a migration from Collao and for the alternative tale of the emergence of the founding fathers from the cave at Paucartambo, so near to Cusco. This concludes Chapter 2.